On this edition of the Newsmakers, is aid in Syria going into the wrong hands? The UN is accused of working too closely with the Assad regime. Also on today's program, a year ago, the picture of a drowned Syrian toddler made headlines around the world. But did it change anything? We ask what power pictures have to make a difference. And in Picture This, celebrations across India at the start of a 10-day festival to honor the Hindu god Ganesh. Hello and welcome to the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garta. Aid agencies operating in war zones carry out some of the most important and dangerous work in the world. And when it comes to Syria, the situation is particularly complex. There are so many different groups fighting each other on the ground, and we're seeing the use of siege tactics and the routine targeting of hospitals. But despite these challenges, is the United Nations doing enough to ensure that aid reaches the people who need it most? An investigation by the UK's Guardian newspaper has shown that the UN awarded contracts worth tens of millions of dollars to people closely linked to the Assad regime and to organizations run by people under US and EU sanctions. Today's newsmaker is Syrian aid, as we ask if it's going into the wrong hands.
The pressure is stacking up.
But I should be absolutely clear. We are absolutely neutral, independent and impartial.
Not only are there tight time constraints to deliver aid to Syrian civilians trapped in the most war-torn areas of the country.
4,000 food rations left. That would be enough for 20,000 people, and the population of East Aleppo is 250,000.
But pressure is also building on the UN itself to set up an inquiry into its Syria aid program. After revelations that as much as 900 million of 1.1 billion in the UN 2015 response plan was spent on aid funneled through Damascus, all of which is controlled by the Syrian regime to varying degrees. The Guardian newspaper conducted the analysis, which suggests that the Syrian government directly benefited from the UN's humanitarian aid program in Syria. It shows that since 2011, the UN has paid the Syrian government more than $13 million to boost farming and agriculture. And yet the EU has banned trade with these departments for fear of how the money will be used. The UN has also paid the state-owned fuel supplier $4 million, which is also on the EU sanctions list. 2 UN agencies have partnered with the Syria Trust Charity, an organization started and chaired by President Bashar al-Assad's wife, paying a total of $8.5 million. Asma Assad is under both US and EU sanctions. And the World Health Organization has spent $5 million to support Syria's National Blood Bank, which is controlled by Syria's Defense Department. There are concerns over whether blood supplies are reaching those in need or are going to pro-Assad forces first. But beyond these findings looms the question, for all those in need in Syria, is it better than nothing? The UN's aid operation in Syria is the most expensive and complex it's ever undertaken. The world body has responded to allegations that funds are falling into the wrong hands, citing limited options in an insecure context. A hurdle that has become more and more difficult with every passing year.
I continue to lobby the government to be more flexible in its approach to humanitarian operations.
The UN says its work has saved millions of lives, and that it can only stay in Syria with the approval of Bashar al-Assad's regime. Damascus also controls who the UN can and can't work with. But critics say the UN must exert more pressure. More than 50 humanitarian, human rights, and civil society groups have co-signed a report which says the UN had given in to demands not to help rebel-held areas. Its task in Syria is unenviable. And in some cases, full transparency is improbable, if not impossible. The challenge now for the world body is not to be further sullied in trying to mediate a conflict with little mercy and no rules. Randolph Nogel, The Newsmakers.
I'm joined here in the studio by Renaud Linders, who's an expert in war studies at King's College London. And from Geneva, I'm joined by William Spindler, spokesperson for the UNHCR. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Renaud, let me start with you. You're heavily quoted in the report and after the report as well. Randolph's report has spelt it all out. These are not just a few $1,000s here or there. These are millions, hundreds of millions of dollars. Do you believe that the UN has been compromised because of this?
Yes, I think so. And this conclusion doesn't come easily or out of nowhere. Basically, I have conducted research on and tried to trace the money flow, so to speak. Basically, in response to accumulating reports that the UN was being compromised and that it was being seen as too close to the regime. I found, after a lot of digging and asking around, that indeed, lots of companies that receive procurement contracts from UN agencies in Damascus were either owned or directly linked to regime incumbents, senior state security officials, people who are responsible for enormous brutality and repression, and are as such sanctioned by the EU and the United States. So I fully acknowledge that the UN has to walk a very precarious balance in conducting its work in Syria. The conditions are incredibly difficult, but I think it has now lost the balance that it should have.
Right. William Spindler, the UN has lost the balance that it should have in Syria. Renaud has followed the money. The facts speak for themselves. Does it feel morally, principally and professionally consistent with UN practice to have these enormous sums of money being funneled through people who are responsible for such barbarity right now?
As you put out in your introduction, we are dealing with unprecedented challenges in Syria. We are trying to reach 13.5 million people who are desperately in need of humanitarian aid. We are working in a country at war with territory controlled by different groups. The challenges that this poses to humanitarian organizations such as UNHCR are huge. There's no denying that. And we don't live in a perfect world. We live in an imperfect world. We have to work under certain constraints. We cannot work in a country without being accredited to that country. The UN must work with the government of a country, with government departments, with partners that have been accredited by that government. Having said that, we choose our own partners based on our own criteria, and our aim is to reach as many people as possible, given the constraints that we have, given the fact that we don't always have access to people where they are, and that we have to work on the very dangerous, difficult, and politically tense environments.
Okay, allow me to jump in there just for a second, William. So one of the facts here is that UNICEF, and I know you don't speak for UNICEF, you're from UNHCR, UNICEF paid almost $300,000 to Al-Bustan charity, which is owned by Rami Makhlouf, Bashar al-Assad's cousin, and the richest man in Syria. Just looking at some of these individual cases, and you ask why? Why was that necessary, if at all? Aren't you asking the same questions?
Well, look, we welcome scrutiny, and our accounts are public, are open, are untransparent. Critics have been able to look at that, as indeed the public are, and we welcome scrutiny of our operations. Our licitation process is transparent, is public, and it's available to anybody who wants to see it. The reality is that we work in environments, often, like in Syria, but in many other parts of the world, where there's very limited choice of the organizations or the companies that can actually deliver what we need on the ground.
Okay.
So we need to work within these constraints, and what critics sometimes fail to answer is, what is the alternative?
Okay, let me ask Renaud, what is the alternative?
Well, first of all, it's not a black and white situation. I've never argued that the United Nations should disengage with the regime as such. That would be an irresponsible thing to do, given the many lives that are dependent upon UN aid. I do argue that the UN should restore a degree of leverage it has, and it should have, vis-à-vis the regime. It will start with refusing to hand out contracts and partnerships and so on with regime entities that are clearly part and parcel of the regime.
Right.
That compromises impartiality.
I want to add to the UN's argument here and pose it to you, Renaud. Just a few months ago at the World Humanitarian Summit, I spoke to Stephen O'Brien, the UN humanitarian chief. At the time, there were lots of difficulties in terms of getting aid to Madaya. I posed it to him. I said, do you guys have a crisis of relevance here that you need permission from the regime and so on and so forth in order to get food to kids who are starving, right? This is what he had to say. Have a listen.
What does save a life is having very brave people on the ground, as we do in Syria, whether it's in Damascus or elsewhere, talking to the Syrian government to get past the checkpoints. And if you're trying to get into Madaya, which I'm glad to say we did after a long period of time of not being able to do so, there are 15 ropes across the road on the way in. You can have a 30-truck convoy. You have to negotiate with the first 8. They're the Syrian government ones. You then negotiate with the next 3. They're Hezbollah. They're waiting for a phone call from Tehran to let you through. You then negotiate with the next 6, which are from the militia within the town, of the people who are representing the besieged people, who say, no, we don't want it in until you actually agree to take people out to evacuate them for medical treatment, and they will actually deny you going in until you get that agreement. And you often can't, because where do you take them in safety? And I can't allow the truck drivers of the convoys to set going if there's a sniper who's waiting to shoot them because we haven't secured an agreement by the very brave people who let us in. That's impartiality, that's neutrality, that's independence, and that's real life saving.
He got pretty angry at me there because I was pushing him on that, and he had this robust defense. And essentially he's saying this is politics, it's ugly, it's dirty, it's awkward, you have to play the game to save as many lives as possible. Do you accept any of that?
I do accept some of that. Yes, indeed. I do acknowledge it's a messy world out there, particularly in Syria, of course. I don't think the delivery of aid is easy. It will be a continuous battle with a lot of frustrations, and indeed the UN will get a lot of flack for problems that are not of its own creation. But having said that, I think again it has lost the balance that it should have. It has allowed, among many other flaws and failures, it has allowed the Syrian regime to redact its needs assessment reports. That's a fact. It is partnering with clear regime entities, so-called NGOs, while including those owned and managed by senior regime incumbents. Now, I do acknowledge that they have limited choices, but there's no reason to do business with Rami Makhlouf.
Right.
There are other charities that are less overtly political and compromised that they could do business with.
Let's pose this to William. William, the UN allowing the Syrian regime to redact its needs assessment reports. That's wrong, right? I mean, you can't say that's right.
Well, I'm not aware of this. I don't have any information about that. I don't speak on behalf of the United Nations as a whole. I speak on behalf of my organization. What I can tell you is that we are working under a very difficult environment, that sometimes we have to make very difficult choices in order to save lives, and that if we were living in a perfect world, perhaps we would not make those choices. But we are living in the real world where in order to save human lives, you need to make some compromises. And we try to do our best to ensure that all the aid that we receive is spent properly. We have a very rigorous publicly accountable system. It's open to anybody, to scrutiny. We answered in detail all the questions that we were submitted by journalists, and this is part of an ongoing process to try to improve our delivery services. We don't claim to be perfect, we don't claim to be always right, but we are working in very difficult conditions, and we are doing our best.
Do you accept, Renaud, that in the interests of impartiality, complete impartiality from the United Nations, when you say when you ask, why are you doing business with companies under US and EU sanctions, they can't abide by those sanctions because you have, for example, other UN Security Council members like Russia who are not enforcing those sanctions. So that would be the UN throwing their lot in with the United States and the European Union and taking sides. Do you accept that argument?
No, I don't, because I don't think this is a legal issue. It is a legal issue for the donors. You might wonder, why do the donors pour in billions of dollars of aid money into agencies, the UN agencies, that breach their own sanctions? But from a UN perspective, it's not a legal issue. They have to abide to UN Security Council sanctions, and they list only jihadist, terrorist people from within the opposition, no regime incumbents. That's because of Russia, China, and all the countries that you mentioned in the Security Council. But it still is an ethical problem and a political problem, because these people who are on the EU and US sanctions list are heavily compromised people and are also identified publicly under these sanctions as having financed, supported, or whatever, the brutality of the regime.
Okay, gentlemen, sincere appreciation for taking the time. It's been a fascinating discussion. Unfortunately, I've got to wrap, but thank you again.
Thank you very much.
Still to come on the Newsmakers, picture power. In the age of social media, can a single image still shape history? And in Picture This, Hindus celebrate the birthday of the elephant god Ganesh. Every now and then, a photograph captures the world's attention. This time a year ago, it was the body of a small boy in a red t-shirt washed up on a Turkish beach. The boy was Alan Kurdi, a 4-year-old Syrian refugee. He certainly wasn't the first nor the last child to die during the dangerous sea crossing to Europe. But he became a symbol for the desperation facing all refugees. But was it anything more than symbolism? And in a world saturated with pictures, does a single image still have the power to bring about change? Natalie Pohernan takes a look.
Thousands of refugees have drowned on their journey to Europe. But one death stands out. Alan Kurdi's. After 5 years of conflict in Syria, this little boy's image shocked the world.
As a father and as a human being, you can't help but be moved by these terrible pictures. Seeing the picture of that poor child on the beach in Turkey, those images will remain with all of us for a very, very long time. But the question you have to ask, not just as a father, but as a Prime Minister, is what are the actions we can take that will really make a difference?
The UK Cabinet agreed to increase its Syrian refugee intake. But a year on, the vision of another young child, this time in Aleppo, became another symbol of Syria's lost childhood. Images like these are powerful enough to stop us, shape opinions, and lead to questions. They linger, like the girl on fire, and a man facing imminent death at the hands of a South Vietnamese general. An iconic moment defined the student protests in Beijing's Tiananmen Square for the outside world. Pictures from Ethiopia suffering drought in 1984 led to global awareness, and some help did come. On September the 11th, 2001, many photos captured horror and resilience, and were used as a rallying cry for action which still resonates today. But in a world of so many images, does one photo still have the potential to change history? Natalie Pohernan, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from New Jersey is Tom Franklin. He's a multimedia journalist and a professor at Montclair State University. Thanks for joining us, Tom. What do you think of the sort of long-term impact of a powerful image such as the body of Alan Kurdi, and whether that can actually lead to some sort of tangible change?
Well, certainly a photograph of a dead child washing up on the surf of a beach is a very upsetting image, not only to parents around the world, but to anybody, you know, with a heart. And that was a very upsetting image, a very difficult image to look at. But these are the types of images that photojournalists record to tell stories, to tell the important stories of our time. And photographs like that, photographs that show death in that manner, are important for people to see, because the Syrian crisis is a story that big, and it needs to get people's attention. And it's hard to believe a year has gone by, and you know, the fighting in Syria rages on.
It's hard to believe a year's gone by. It's hard to believe 15 years have gone by since 9/11, and you had one of the most memorable pictures of 9/11. 8 hours after the attack, 3 firemen with an American flag, they took it off a yacht and raised it in the wreckage. It was called the most memorable flag raising since Iwo Jima. How much of an impact do you think that had 15 years on the world and perceptions of that traumatic and momentous event?
Well, I think the picture became very popular because of 9/11 being such a horrific event, yet this was a photograph that didn't show planes crashing into the towers or people falling from the upper floors. It showed a picture of 3 firemen raising a flag, and the symbolism of the picture is pretty clear. You know, it's the symbolism of patriotism, of strength, of resolve. And I think that's what resonated with people. And what was interesting about this photograph was that it was used on a U.S. postage stamp and in other ways to raise money for victims of that tragedy, and raised over $10 million, which is an extraordinary number. And speaks volumes to the notion that you know, a photograph can be very powerful and can bring about change.
Looking at it from another direction, perhaps, with Alan Kurdi, you have this young boy, you know, washed up on the beach. One of the major arguments against accepting refugees in Europe was that most of these people are young men who are benefit scroungers. They want to come for benefits and so on and so forth. And this flies in the face of that, because you have a picture of a child and this family sort of risking their lives trying to make it, escaping the civil war. 9/11 as well, you have a lot of the photography, for example, of the Pentagon debunking some of the 9/11 truthers, right? They said, oh, it might have been a rocket that went into the Pentagon. But then you have hundreds of photographs of the fuselage and the engine and so on and so forth. So might there also be a great importance in terms of setting the record straight, setting the historical record straight, and fixing misperceptions about a major event?
Well, look, virtually everybody today is a photojournalist to a certain extent. Everybody, virtually everybody, posts photographs on social media, and they're doing reporting. Some, you know, substantial reporting, and others are inconsequential, but they're still doing reporting. Professional journalists, professional photojournalists have a standard of ethics and responsibility that goes along with their reporting. And I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I think it's pretty clear what happened on 9/11, and the photographs support that and document that. And that 9/11 was perhaps the most, it was documented in the most extraordinarily way by photojournalists, both in New York and in Washington. The pictures from that day were extraordinary, considering, you know, the circumstances were so dire. And, you know, photographs like this child washing up on shore, the photograph of the young boy in the ambulance, which was in the news quite recently, these are important images. These are important images for people to see, to get people's attention. You know, people here in the States might say, oh, Syria, it's over there. Turkey's over there. It doesn't really impact me, but yet it does. And these lives matter, and these photographs are really important to not only get people's attention, but to set the record straight.
Tom Franklin, good to talk to you. Tom Franklin joining us there from Montclair, New Jersey. In today's Picture This, Hindus across India are showing their devotion to their elephant-headed god Ganesh. The annual festival lasts 10 days, and devotees hope it'll bring them good fortune and knowledge. Let's take a look. Today's Newsmaker was Syrian aid, as we focused on the challenge of making sure it gets to the right people. It's an enormous logistical challenge which involves complex negotiations with all sorts of groups. But the UN has come under pressure for working too closely with the regime in the delivery of aid. One of our guests is an expert in war studies and has researched where the money has been channeled to in Syria. He says the UN has lost the balance it should have. But we also heard from a spokesman for UNHCR who said many of the accusations are unfair, adding that the conditions in Syria are incredibly difficult, and to save lives, they have to make compromises. You've been watching this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Gupta. Thank you for watching. See you tomorrow. Bye-bye.